Everyone. Good afternoon and welcome to another session of our MA Apex webinar series. I'm Tom Wilbur, and it's a pleasure to kick off today's presentation on cybersecurity guidance and CMMC. As many of you know, CMMC and cybersecurity has become one of the most pressing priorities across today's defense industrial base in DoW contractor network. With evolving requirements and the rollout of frameworks like CMMC, staying ahead of those challenges is essential for anyone working with the Department of War. That's exactly why today's session, Cybersecurity Guidance, CMMC 123, is very timely. I'm delighted to introduce our speaker, Kareem Sykes. Kareem serves as Director of Industry and Engagement at Eccalon, where he works at the intersection of industry collaboration and national defense. He brings a wealth of experience fostering meaningful engagement between government and industry partners, and he's dedicated to helping organizations navigate the complex cybersecurity landscape. His unique vantage point makes him exceptionally well positioned today to break down those requirements, offer some practical guidance, and maybe even answer some questions that you may have surrounding CMMC in the recent days. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Kareem Sykes. Kareem, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tom, and I just want to extend a warm thank you to the Massachusetts Apex Accelerator and the fantastic work and resolve that you all have in aiding small businesses around the defense industrial base. Certainly, Tom, I couldn't think of anything more apropos than precisely what you laid out there. When we think about cybersecurity compliance writ large, it is the polarity around it, specifically in the defense industrial base, but really, I think, around the federal contracting environment writ large, right? I think there's just a myriad of thoughts and perceptions and even misperceptions that are all too pervasive. And so I think at a time like where we find ourselves now in the ecosystem, Project Spectrum just has ineffable, utility, right? In the context of providing clarity, education, tools, resources, specifically aimed at small businesses, but certainly that are applicable to businesses of any size. And for that matter, businesses in virtually any industry. As we know, all industries need to protect and preserve the manner in which they're handling sensitive data, right? Relative to their company, relative to their constituents, relative to their business partners. And so with that, we're going to be talking about equipping small businesses, professionals with cybersecurity preparedness, and certainly the cybersecurity model, the cybersecurity maturity model certification. So a couple key sort of pillars here, obviously knowing the risk, building your knowledge around that risk, applying solutions, and then, of course, strengthening our nation, recurring themes that you'll likely hear today as we go through it. ProjectSpectrum.io. If you have not visited that website and registered, it costs you nothing to do that. It takes about probably 2 minutes of your time. Please do that today. It is a way that you will get access to all of the resource provisioning that I'll be talking about here today. Okay, so I think Tom pretty much summed it up. I mean, look, I've been at this for more than 25 years. ITSM, information assurance management, cybersecurity readiness, federal compliance, and tech modernization. So not only have I led national engagement across Project Spectrum, our links tool, which you may have heard the Department of War recently unveiled fairly recently here over the last several months. And then Valiant Secure Cloud, which is Eccalon's provisioning of a secure cloud environment in which companies can process, store, and transmit FCI and CUI data, both the sort of critical pieces there to CMMC, which we'll talk about here subsequently. But really, again, my goal is to sort of cut through the noise, right? Project Spectrum and Eccalon, we've been out front on cyber compliance whenever Congress reached out to the Department of War to say, hey, what are we doing to help small businesses, really navigate what would otherwise be exorbitant costs in not only just preparing for, right, CMMC, not even getting into sort of the cost, subsequent, but just in preparation for it, understanding, education, awareness, tools, resources, training, right? So whenever Congress asked the department, hey, what are we doing there? Project Spectrum was called to the forefront and leveraged to really help provide clear guidance, actionable guidance for those small businesses, government leaders, primes, and industry stakeholders. And so, again, I've been around the country traveling and talking about this for probably the last, 6 or 7 years. And in that regard, we've been really the thought leaders on cyber compliance as it relates to CMMC specifically, but even beyond that. And so I'm going to be talking today about kind of who we are, what's our mission, our overview, the threat landscape, certainly, and then CMMC deep dive, a little bit about the levels, the assessments, and even some of the appertaining regulations and why that's important for you all as small businesses in the defense industrial base. In practice, we're going to talk about kind of scenarios, how we help the sort of confluence of resources you'll hear me talk about today with sort of a typical scenario for compliance and how that sort of coalesces. We'll also talk about any new updates that we have on the website, including some of our monthly webinars, our cyber circuit events where we're bringing in industry professionals from within and around the defense industrial base and beyond to really share best practices relative to the latest and greatest in terms of cyber compliance, small business oriented subject matter writ large, and even some of our strategic partnerships. We'll talk a lot about that as well. Project Spectrum. So who are we? Well, we're a Department of War endorsed cybersecurity awareness initiative. And we were strategically designed to really help small businesses strengthen not only cyber hygiene, but improve their cybersecurity readiness, which includes the compliance requirements you probably hear a lot about these days, CMMC, the DFARS, 7012 specifically, and really preparation for CMMC and government contracting requirements as it pertains to cybersecurity. So through projectspectrum.io, again, that's the URL you're going to go to register. Those small businesses are really able to gain access to no-cost cybersecurity resources right on the website, including training, self-assessment tools, templates, cyber readiness support, where you can actually surface questions, not to some chatbot or some automated tool, but to an actual live FTE, someone who's steeped in the technology, someone who understands not only cyber from a sort of kind of technical acumen, technical astute perspective, but someone who actually understands the sort of regulatory and policy side of the compliance piece that is ever present in as much as CMMC is concerned. And so there you have a myriad of resources, again, all toward the end rather, of getting you ready for technical assistance and guidance aligned to federal cybersecurity expectations. And so, yeah, as you see there to the right, we are called out in the FY26 National Defense Authorization Act. We're very proud of that by name. We are also written up in the DoD Small Business Strategy, which was published back in 2023. And we remain at the forefront, right? Again, cutting through a lot of the noise out there. There's so many folks in the cyber compliance space, and there's a lot of misconception. There's a lot of consternation around kind of the ever-evolving or seemingly ever-evolving cybersecurity landscape, specifically as it relates to CMMC, and we'll talk about that as well. But again, this idea of knowing the risk, building knowledge, applying solutions, and then ultimately strengthening the nation, right? That's really what we're talking about. And so this is a good segue into this slide, where we're talking about kind of Project Spectrum's role relative to bolstering homeland defense. Now, the Department of War Office of Industrial Base Growth, as I said, we initiated Project Spectrum as a comprehensive platform to provide and training needed, but it's bigger than just that, right? It's not just a compliance exercise or a compliance checkbox that really speaks to the utility of Project Spectrum. It's that we're advancing national security priorities in so doing. And so when we think about the fact that we're strengthening national security by supporting those businesses that provide technological solutions, again, toward the aim in many cases of reestablishing deterrence and modernizing the defense industrial base, while the manner in which they process, store, and transmit sensitive data, for example, CUI, and even FCI on some levels. Again, how we secure that all matters because it all lends to how it is that we're making sure that the way in which not only companies are exchanging data within the defense industrial base as contractors, but then how they're exchanging that information with prime contractors, and then ultimately the government itself. Again, making sure that it all points in between, whether data is sitting or whether it's at, or rather in transit or at rest, that in fact it is secure, right? And that's a huge piece in terms of how we ultimately protect our warfighter and deliver those critical products and services that small businesses are so inextricably tied to. When we think about the citation authorities, obviously Title 10 of the U.S. Code, 2224, Title 15 of the U.S. Code, 638, and then Title 10 of the U.S. Code, 4901. Again, this idea, the recurring theme throughout those citations, again, we talk about the Defense Information Assurance Act, and then we talk about how is it that small businesses are being really, their concerns are being addressed, and how are we involving them to remove barriers to entry for small and mid-sized businesses as it relates to the supply chain for the defense industrial base and certainly for the national industrial base writ large. And so I think, again, some key elements of what has happened there from a policy perspective and kind of why we exist. Now, many of you know, I'm just going to move this out of the way and make sure that you all can see everything here. But many of you know that CMMC has arrived, right? And what you'll most remember is that when CMMC 2.0 rolled out, and we begin with November 10th of 2025, right? Which is when applicable solicitations as part of phase 1 of the CMMC implementation plan. It's where applicable solicitations requiring level 1 or 2 self-assessments was really the focal point. And that began November 10th of 2025, right? Phase 2 was set to have begun on November 10th, 2026, very, very soon here, right? Well, many of you probably are tracking that the Department of War CIO issued a pause, if you will, on the implementation of phase 2 at November 10th, 2026. That phase 2 was set to entail applicable solicitations that were going to require level 2 certification, which if you were tracking was where you would have had to have met with a C3PO, a third-party assessor organization, right? A CMMC third-party assessor organization, in order to have attained level 2 certification. And you would have needed that to have been done by that 10 November 2026 date there. Well, that on July 13th, a memo was published to pause that, and I'll talk more about that shortly. But that's phase 2. We're talking about level 2 certification, right? Phase 3 rather is where we get into applicable solicitations that were going to require level 3 certification, and that was set to have begun on November 10th of 2027. And then phase 4 full implementation of CMMC was set to have been in place there as of 10 November 2028, in which case all solicitations and contracts would include applicable levels of CMMC level requirements as a condition of contract award. Now, there are a few caveats to the phased implementation plan for CMMC, and that is there's 2 instances I can think of that I think are noteworthy to point out here where CMMC would not be applicable necessarily, and that is if in fact a procurement that was issued was going to be under the micro purchase threshold for the Department of War, which if you're tracking as of October of last year, that was raised from 10,000 to 15,000. So any procurement 15,000 or less is not subject to CMMC necessarily. And then the other caveat would be if in fact a procurement solicitation was issued for a commercial off-the-shelf product or a COTS product, right? That is with no modification being made to it, just again, literally commercial off-the-shelf as it is, if you will, that as well would not be subject to CMMC compliance. And so what made this happen as of 10 November 2025, building on Title 32 of the Code of Federal Regulations, 48 CFR, or the Title 48 of the Code of Federal Regulations, had to do with the implementation of it. And so That final rule was published there in September 10th of 2025. And then that went into effect on November 10th, 2025, following the mandatory 60-day public comment period, with which is required whenever there's a rule change there. And so that triggered the first phase, the first phase of the CMMC phased rollout. Again, that 4 phases over those 3 years. And so what has essentially happened at this point, and this is where we find ourselves, we see that there's been a shift. Yet again, if you've been tracking CMMC, you know that it has not been without its changes over the years. And so right now, the Department on July 13th, if you're tracking that Department of War CIO memo, it again paused the phase 2 transition, right? And any subsequent levels of compliance, so level 3 of CMMC as well, while they do this 60-day CMMC reform review, right? And part of what they're doing here is they're going back and we've seen this before, right? So whenever there's been a new CIO, obviously Kirsten Davies, the CIO for the Department of War, relatively new to the role, at least with the Department of War, is taking a pause here to say, hey, this is going to, as it stands, if we were to go by that 10 November 2026 date, it would preclude many businesses that are providing critical services and resources from participating in the defense industrial base and the supply chain, very, very much needed companies, right? And so basically they're doing a pause to kind of look at this. They're going to have a 60-day review period. There's going to be a report that's going to be published and sent to the CIO at the conclusion of that. And from there, they're going to put some analysis to this and say, is there any other way, right, that makes sense, that won't be so financially burdensome to small businesses in the defense industrial base? Is there another way that we can do this, right, without imposing burdensome costs and compliance requirements vis-a-vis having to go through a third-party assessor, and then the associated cost, which can be very expensive to do that, right? So again, what changed? Well, phase 2 requirements originally scheduled for 10 November are suspended for now. Pending and future CMMC implementation milestones across the Department of War solicitations are also paused as well. A CMMC reform task force will recommend realistic and scalable security measures to hopefully figure out a way outside of what's already been suggested there in terms of the C3PAO assessor. And let's talk about what did not change, because I think this is absolutely critical, right? When you read that Arsenal of Freedom memo, if you read it carefully, one of the things that absolutely did not change is that phase 1 self-assessment requirements remain firmly in place. Now, I want to be clear here. Phase 1, if I'll go back here just for the purposes of revisiting this, if you look at phase 1 here, it's where applicable solicitations require level 1 or level 2 self-assessments, right? Why do I highlight that? Because what that means is we're still on a track where you have to make sure that you're meeting all of those requirements at levels 1 of CMMC and levels 2, right? What they're pausing is how the level 2 specifically is how those will be assessed, right? So the third-party assessor piece, the C3PL, all of that is on pause. But level 1 and level 2 self-assessments or self-attestation, which was again required as of 10 November 2025, right? That is still at play, right? So NIST 800-171 Rev 2 remains the interim enforcement baseline, and that is being enforced, okay? Now, it's worth pointing out that the requirements, those 110 requirements, we'll talk about those as well, that are derived from NIST 800-171, those are the same requirements at CMMC level 2, right? So again, what the department is saying here is you still have to meet these requirements, but we're pausing on the way in which we're going to have those assessed, right? Right now, they were, or prior to this memo on July 13th from the Pentagon, they were relying on C3PAOs to be able to conduct those assessments, and thereby forcing companies that were handling CUI by level of criticality that warranted level 2 certification to go through that third party. That's what's on hold at present, right? That you don't have to go to that third party right now as they figure out kind of what's the next best way to do this, right? What is a better way to do this? DFARS 7012. So DFARS 252.204-7012. That, by the way, has been around since December of 2016. Okay. So those are obligations to safeguard covered defense information, and they remain enforceable as per that memo on July 13th from the Department of War CIO. So again, Project Spectrum's position is do not relent, right? This is a point where you want to recalibrate. You want to continue executing your cybersecurity strategy while the department refines the sort of certification pathway at level 2, right? And perhaps level 3, depending on how things shake out. But the reality is you want to continue to protect federal contract information. You want to continue to protect CUI data, controlled and classified information. You want to continue doing self-assessments, right? And making sure that what you're self-attesting to, that you're actually meeting, right? One of the things that becomes very critical with a pause like this is people will think, oh, you know what? I knew this was not going to work out. I've been saying it, there's no way it's going to work. And that's not what the department is saying here, right? If you read that memo carefully, right? So self-assess, update your supplier performance risk system scores, which is where at level 1, you would submit that assessment results to. That's called the supply performance risk system. And then 3, improve your remediation gaps, right? And then sustain, document evidence, and mature your cybersecurity posture and hygiene, right? All of these things, Project Spectrum is extremely well suited to help you with, right? Right on our website, you're able to take the self-assessment itself if you need to. You are able to not only take the self-assessment, but you can actually do some gap analysis, and we'll talk about what that looks like as well. But the idea is that, yes, there is a pause on the phase 2 implementation, right, having to do with those companies that were handling CUI or were going to be handling CUI at a level of criticality that it would have warranted them meeting with a C3 PAO in order to go for certification. That is what's on pause, not the fact that you still have to meet levels 1 and 2, if applicable, self-attestation, right, and the requirements there too. Why it all matters? Well, we're going to look at kind of an overview of the cyber threat landscape. We're going to look at some federal regulations appertaining, again, to help you understand the evolving threat landscape, to really understand how those regulations actually play into what you have to meet. And then this idea of protecting your business, your data, and of course, national security. So when we think about the cyber threat landscape, and we know that more than 40% of all cyber attacks are targeting small and medium-sized businesses, right? We know that a mere 14% of those small and medium-sized companies have plans to mitigate these attacks, right? And so when we think about the almost 3/4 of breaches that are caused by human error, we know that there's absolutely a need for education and training, which is what Project Spectrum is very, very well suited for. And so when we think about cyber attacks and the associated costs of them, I mean, would you agree? Just drop in the chat there a thumbs up if you agree that $653,000 is deal breaker territory if you're a small business in the defense industrial base, right? Particularly a micro small, right? I mean, that's like, close the doors type territory probably, right? And if not for the monetary element of what that exposure brings about, how about the reputational damage, right? With some of the intangibles. When we think about the reasons that small and medium-sized companies are targeted, well, we know there's IP concerns. So intellectual property and trade secrets, dual-use technologies, even access to sensitive government information certainly would play in there. But that interconnection with larger defense contractors is, I think, a really, really salient reminder that, it really just helps us debunk some of the myths, right? So some people say, hey, my company, Kareem, is too small. Nobody's thinking about it. I mean, we made just barely $1 million last year, which is, relatively insignificant to some relative to some of the profits in the defense industrial base, at least by perception. Well, that's precisely why you would have laser targets on you as a small and medium-sized business by those would-be attackers or nation-state actors, right? Reality is that there's also political and ideological motivations, right? And so we want to debunk some of the myths around why small and medium-sized companies are targeted. and really help them understand that if you're a small and mid-sized business, particularly if you're a micro small, I mean, you have laser threat vectors aimed at you, right? And so we want to clear that up. Now, FCI and CUI data, again, here, the predicate determinants for what level of CMMC compliance you as a small business would be pursuing. Is your company handling federal contract information consistent with the FAR clause, 52.204-21, right? FCI being sensitive yet unclassified information, again, provided by or generated for the government under a contract. And you can see some examples there to the upper right. Most notably there, obviously RFP, RFI responses, process documentation, any sort of organizational charts, obviously contract information, those performance reports, right? CPARs, things like that, right? When we think about controlled and classified information, okay? Now we're getting into the DFARS clause 252.204-7012. Again, not new at all, right? Has been around for quite some time. And some examples of CUI, again, information that is that the U.S. federal government either creates or possesses, or that an entity creates or possesses on behalf of the government, and that a law, regulation, or government-wide policy requires or permits an agency to protect said data via safeguarding and or dissemination controls. So when we think about sort of the traditional FOUO, law enforcement sensitive, SBU, right? Some of the ones that we're probably more familiar with, those were all sort of subsumed under CUI. And for example, proprietary business information when in the hands of the government, that would also constitute CUI. And so there's different types of CUI data out there, which is why you have kind of a bifurcation between levels 2 and level 3. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. But again, understanding FCI and CUI data, why is that important for you as a small business? Because that's going to dictate what level of CMMC compliance is going to be relevant and germane to you, right? Foreign ownership, control, or influence. This is another piece that's absolutely critical. And when you register with us at projectspectrum.io, you're going to have access to FOCI training courses that are going to cover what foreign ownership, control, or influence is. Now, while you may hear that foreign investment is, in some cases, or even, you might hear that it's something that, small businesses can utilize. There absolutely have to be right and left delimiters as to what that foreign investment has actually purchased a company in terms of what do they have access to as a result of having made said investment, right, into a US-based company. So again, it happens when a foreign entity has the power to direct or influence the management or operations of a company there in that first one. And number two, FOCI issues affect the company's ability to qualify for and maintain eligibility to contract with the government, right? And so manufacturing, we know that sector in particular accounts for more than 22% of the reported cyber espionage incidents. Again, major risk factors here. FOCI always sits, not always, but in very, very many cases, sits at the forefront of said espionage incidences. We think about the 2020, the FY23 NDAA, Section 875 specifically calls out the Department of War's need to establish a program that demonstrates commercial due diligence tools, techniques, and processes, right? To really help these small businesses not only identify attempts by malicious foreign actors, but also looking at how do we help them understand what foreign ownership, control, and influence means for their business. And so one of the sort of recurring themes that you see throughout the FOCI training and even other trainings on projectspectrum.io for that matter, is this notion of properly identifying, evaluating the impact of, and then reducing the associated risks with, right? And so that is a mainstay of our training offerings. We offer many trainings. We'll talk more about some of those a bit later. But I want to jump right into the model for anyone who has any uncertainty as to what the CMMC model and the associated assessments are. Let's dive into that. So first, let's talk about CMMC level 1 at the bottom here, a little bit sort of counterintuitive visually here, but level 1, right, is going to deal with the foundational level, right? We're talking about 15 requirements, all of which are aligned with the FAR clause 52.204-21, right? Again, think about basic data safeguarding for businesses when there's going to be, from an assessment perspective, annual self-assessments there, right, at level one. You're also going to have annual affirmation, right, which means that you have to attest that, in fact, every year, right, after you're granted the certification, every year, that in fact you're still meeting the same requirements that you were at the point at which you were granted kind of the go-ahead for compliance there at level one. Level two, right? This is where you're talking about advanced or enhanced data safeguarding for businesses that are handling either basic or specified CUI data. Again, something the product inspection can absolutely help you with. Those 110 controls, considerably more there at level two, you'll note. That's where you're going to be dealing with the alignment of those controls with NIST 800-171 Rev 2, which, by the way, that memo on July 13th, again, doubled down on, right? Saying that those NIST 800-171 Rev 2 requirements are still very, very much at play here, right? And companies still need to be in line with those if, in fact, they're handling CUI data, okay? A C3PO assessment every 3 years, that is what's on hold right now, just to be clear, right? So what that memo did is it paused that piece. It said, hey, I know right now we were talking about level two certification being kind of a hard line in the sand as of November 10th of 2026. For companies that had to go through that C3PO process, we're pausing that, right? So we're saying that's suspended right now until this 60-day review happens within the Department of War. But in that case, self-assessment, in the other case at level two, because there's two tracks at level two, we'll talk about those as well. There's a situation where at level two, you may be able to self-assess, right? And so we know now with that memo having been issued on July 13th, that level one and two self-assessments are still very much at play here, right? That also has to happen every 3 years if you're in that sort of self-attestation track at level two, right? Annual affirmation, again, a recurring theme throughout each of the levels of CMMC from an assessment perspective, still there, right? Still having to attest every year that you're meeting those requirements subsequent to being granted CMMC compliance there. CMMC level three, we're talking about 134 requirements consistent with NIST 800-171 Rev 2, plus the 24 requirements that are additional from NIST SP 800-172, right? And so the confluence of both of those, NIST 800-171 Rev 2 plus the 24 from NIST 800-172 at level three, comprise that 134 total requirements. And from an assessment perspective, DIBCAC, or the Defense Industrial Base Cyber Assessment Center, they're going to do those assessments every 3 years. Again, assuming that that this pause resumes and that all that's still in play. Right now, all that's on pause between levels 2 and 3, at least from a certification perspective, right? And we'll kind of make that a little bit clearer in subsequent slides, hopefully. But one thing to note at level 3, think about this is where you're talking about the highest priority programs in the sort of Department of Defense or the Department of War, Defense Industrial Base, in the unclassified space, right? So again, CUI data related to national security programs or high value assets, right? And again, annual affirmation is in fact at play there as well, even at level 3. All right, so let's talk about the assessment requirements a little bit clearer here and from a kind of a slide-by-slide view here. So level 1, we know that annual self-attestation has always been there, and that is still at play very much for those contractors that are handling FCI data only, right? So if you're handling federal contract information, you're going to be at level 1, and you're going to be self-attesting, right? But again, you're going to want to make sure that indeed, when you self-attest, right, particularly in the case that level 2, that this pause does bear out a situation in which the certification process goes away vis-a-vis the CMMC certified third-party assessors. If that goes away sort of permanently, I know right now we're in a pause on it for these 60 days, but if that goes away and the department has clearly said in that memo that self-attestation for levels 1 and 2 still is very much at play, well, then what that means then is that instead of having someone who's steeped in this from a compliance perspective, that is a CMMC certified assessor hired by a C3PAO, right? Where prior to this memo on the 13th, you would have gone through them for your certification if you were in that certification track at level 2. Well, if that goes away, that means that all of the responsibility is on you as a contractor, and that when you self-attest, that indeed what you say you're meeting, you are in fact meeting, right? And that you're aware of what that means to meet that, right? And that's we've seen where that's it. There's been a big knowledge gap, right? And this is where Project Spectrum and the efficacy of what we're doing in terms of education awareness becomes absolutely critical, right? So I want you to understand that self-assessing is not this thing of, oh, I'll just check the boxes and I'll get there later when I get time to do it. No, this is very, very serious, because now you're in a situation where self-attestation is very much at the forefront, right? For levels 1 and 2. Okay. So that if you say you're meeting something, you absolutely need to make sure that you're aware of what you're saying you're meeting, and that in fact you are meeting that, and you can document, and you have documentation and support to suffice that, right? And so to be compliant at level 1, all findings must result in either a met or non-applicable status, right? Plans of action and milestones are not permitted at level 1, right? So in other words, if you're at level 1, those 15 requirements that we talked about, you're either meeting them or you're not, or they're non-applicable. And that non-applicable comes in when we talk about scoping, which again is something else that Project Spectrum staff can help you with, right? Understanding, what's in and out of bounds relative to your cyber compliance journey. Again, all the more reason for why we're at the forefront of this. Self-assessment results, again, are going to be submitted to the Supplier Performance Risk System at CMMC level 1. And when conducting those self-assessments, a CMMC certification is not required or issued at this level, right? Because self-attestation suffices in lieu of having to have an actual certification, right? So you're able to register with Project Spectrum at absolutely no cost to you. Again, by visiting the website, creating a username, password. We're going to ask you some information about your company, your industry, and some other information. And once you do that, you have access to the full suite of resources that the Department of War has subsidized through us at projectspectrum.io. All right, let's talk about CMMC level 2 from an assessment requirements perspective. All right, so level 2, and again, this is prior to this recent hold here on July 13th, vis-a-vis this memo from the Department of War CIO that I've been talking about. There's really 2 tracks for level 2. There's either self-attestation, in which case you're able to self-attest just like you would at level 1, right? Except that at level 2, of course, you're dealing with 110 requirements, right? Consistent with NIST 800-171 Rev 2, right? You're still able to leverage the financial savings by using Project Spectrum's assessment tools, the trainings, the cyber advisory, virtual help desk that we have, where you can surface questions to our team. And again, they can get back to you in short order. CMMC certification from a self-attestation track at level 2 is not required or issued, right? Because you're able to self-attest in lieu of having to go for an actual certification, right? Scores are uploaded again to that Supplier Performance Risk System if you're in that self-attestation track at level 2. And then again, you're still able to leverage all those resources on projectspectrum.io, right? So all the trainings, plans of action and milestones training, system security plan fundamentals training, incident response training, right? All of these things that are relative to your cyber compliance posture, all of those things you're able to leverage on Project Spectrum to help you toward that goal, even if you're in the self-attestation track at level 2. Now, again, prior to that memo being issued on the 13th, we had been under the impression and had been the order of the day that for companies that were handling certain types of CUI data, right, at level 2, that they would have to go for certification, in which case it would involve a triennial every 3-year cycle assessment, right? Certification must be performed, would have had to have been performed by a CMMC third-party assessment organization, right? That again is what's on pause right now, this whole certification track. But I'm still mentioning it because I want you to be aware of it, because this is actually what's been in place. So this memo has just kind of paused this. And so we don't know what's going to happen after this 60 days. And so that's why we're still discussing it, because we want you to be aware of this, that this is how things we're moving forward, pending obviously the results of this pause, right? So businesses, you would normally have to, if you're handling CUI of a certain criticality, and we'll talk about that in a subsequent slide, that in fact you would have to meet with a CMMC certified third-party assessment organization, otherwise known as a C3PAO. And those C3POs hire what's called CCAs, CMMC certified assessors. And those are the people that actually were conducting the assessments for companies at level 2 that were handling a certain level of CUI data, right? Higher criticality CUI data for defense. And so in the case of certification, again, prior to the sort of hold in this memo, assessments were to be submitted to the CMMC Enterprise Mission Assurance Support Services System, right? That otherwise known as EMAS, right? And so if you were in, either you're going to be in a self-attestation track or you're going to be in the certification track at level 2, in which case, in either case, you have a minimum passing score of 88 out of 110 that you would need to achieve. That still holds true today, even with the pause with the memo. So in other words, you're able to self-attest right now at level 2. They've paused certification at CMMC level 2, as we've known it, right? Meeting with that C3PO and all that. That's paused. But the fact that they're telling you that you have to self-attest at level 2, again, if you're handling CUI data, right? Is such that the minimum passing score of 88 out of 110 controls is still very much at play. That is still the hard requirement, even while the pause is going on per the memo, right? All right, now this is the part, because I know what you're asking. I know what you're thinking, right? If you're like many of my audiences, you're thinking, Kareem, that sounds great, but okay, depending on what the department does with this pause of certification at level 2, right, which has to do with the phase 2 of the implementation as they rolled it out, depending on what they do with this, how will I know if the CUI data that I'm handling would reach the level of where I'm able to self-attest, or would reach the point at which I'd have to go for some sort of certification, right? If it's of a higher, the CUI data is of a higher criticality. Well, if that's your question, this is the NARA registry. So it's called the National Archives Records Administration. And within the NARA registry, they have what's called organizational index groupings, right? What that means for you is for defense, right? So for defense, you're looking at, are you handling CUI that would fall under controlled technical information, Department of War critical infrastructure security information, naval nuclear propulsion information, privileged safety information, or unclassified controlled nuclear information for defense. And again, prior to this memo coming out on the 13th, if the CUI data that your company was handling or would be handling in the course of executing on a procurement opportunity with the Department of War, if that CUI data fell within one of those 5 category types that I just read that you see on your screen under defense there, your company would have need to have met with a CMMC third-party assessment organization to achieve level 2 certification. But again, that memo on the 13th has paused this, okay? So I want you to kind of keep a perspective that says, okay, I see what the requirement was prior to the 13th, right? And we don't know what's going to happen on the heels of this 60-day review that the Department of War is conducting, right? The CIO office is conducting. And so I want to make you aware of what the lay of the land was prior to the 13th of July of 2026. I want to make you aware of that so that you know what that is. That way, depending on what happens with this, what the eventuality is, one way or the other, that you at least know what the lay of the land has been prior to that July 13th memo that was issued. All right, level 3. All right, so level 3 entailed a triennial every 3-year cycle assessment. We talked about the fact that there are, at level 3, 24 requirements unique to level 3. That is, in addition to the 110 that level 3 subsumes from level 2, right? And that coupled together gives you that 134 requirements at level 3 in total. But the prerequisite prior again to that memo on the 13th was that you had to fully achieve level 2, meaning you were meeting all 110 controls at level 2 before even being eligible for going for level 3 compliance. And again, remember, level 3 is again the highest criticality programs in the defense industrial base in the unclassified space that are handling CUI data, right? So it's CUI data right? But it's of a level of criticality that warrants not only the Defense Industrial Base Cyber Assessment Center to do the assessments for, as opposed to having it farmed out, for example, to a third party. But it also is such that it's much higher than that which would be handled at level 2, right? To put it kind of in simplest terms. But again, those assessments would have been submitted to the CMMC Enterprise Mission Assurance Support Services System, otherwise known as EMAS. And again, annual affirmation is absolutely required there as well. But again, all of that, levels 2 and level 3, level 2 certification and level 3 is what's being paused here, right? Levels 1 self-assessment and levels 2 self-assessment are still forging ahead, full steam ahead per that memo, right? Let's then talk about a compliance scenario, kind of give you an overview for meeting CMMC compliance requirements utilizing Project Spectrum. All right, so one of the things with Project Spectrum is that we're going to help you discern and select the appropriate level of compliance first and foremost. That's going to be predicated upon whether you're handling FCI or CUI data, right? Then in step 2 of this compliance journey, we're going to look at some scoping, right? So one of the things that the Department of War CIO has published long since now is scoping guidance relative to each of the respective 3 levels of compliance, levels 1, levels 2, and level 3, right? So Project Spectrum has synthesized that scoping guidance, and we understand what that looks like, and we can help you understand what's going to be in and out of bounds relative to your infrastructure or your compliance setup, right? Whether that's a on-premise environment that you're setting up, right? Or if it's an instantiation in the cloud, right? Let's say you're doing a cloud-based solution to meet compliance. Step 3, the green area here, we're going to help you conduct a pre-self-assessment. That is taking the self-assessment right on projectspectrum.io, in which case you're going to be able to see not only what you're where you are relative to the controls, but then you can export that data into either a CSV or PDF file for you to then be able to go back and do some really targeted gap analysis, which is at step 4 there. And then at step 5, we're going to look at whether developing a remediation plan is in order, or if a plan of action and milestones is applicable. Obviously, at level 1, you're not allowed to do a plan of action and milestones, but at level 2, you absolutely are, but it has to be remediated. In other words, any controls that you're not meeting, let's say out of the 110, let's say you score 88, right? Well, those remaining controls, that is what's left of the 110, those remaining controls would have to be codified in a plan of action and milestones document, and then you'd have to remediate those within 180 days, right? So that's the guideline there. So within 6 months, you'd have to resolve any items from a plan of action and milestones. And then implementation of security controls. We're going to help you look at what that looks like, right? Are we going to implement those for you? No, but we are going to certainly walk you through what and how you would have to implement those controls if you reach out and leverage our support team. Preparation of documentation and evidence, right? We're going to look at what are the policies, what are the procedures, what are the plans, right? Relative to your infrastructure, relative to your environment, right? To your network topology, how are things set up in your environment? We're going to help you understand what that looks like from a documentation and evidence collecting perspective, right? Which is absolutely critical, by the way. That's a huge piece of CMMC compliance. It has to do with preparation of documentation and evidence. Many people focus almost exclusively on the technical controls, but there's a lot of documentation and evidence that has to support that. And that any sort of one that would be looking at whether you're meeting this or not would be saying, okay, where's the documentation? Not just the documentation for documentation's sake, but is it actually evidentiary that in fact you're doing what it is that you purported you're doing, right? And again, this becomes absolutely critical in this sort of land of self-attestation that we sort of find ourselves in, particularly during this 60-day review hold here or pause. Conducting the final self-assessment, step 8 there, is going to be sort of the totality of all the predecessor steps, right? So having discern the appropriate level of compliance, having conducting that scoping assessment, and most notably having conducted that baseline self-assessment there, that pre-self-assessment at step 3, the culmination of everything subsequent and predecessor is going to really give us at step 8 kind of that final picture there, right? So in the interim, perhaps you did the gap analysis and you said, you know what, I know I'm not doing so well on these controls, But you know what? I'm going to go and look at Project Spectrum's training courses, their micro courses, which are CMMC control specific, right? Which speak, for example, to, let's say, authorized access control, right? Or physical security, or some of these other elements that I need to be cognizant of. I can go right to a micro course that speaks right to what I need and become very smart on it in a relatively short period of time, so that I at least know exactly what I need to do in order to become compliant, right? That sort of assistance, that sort of targeted assistance and thought leadership that we put into these courses, these modules, it becomes invariable, frankly. All right, we talked about kind of looking at the appropriate level of compliance. Again, predicated on FCI or CUI data, depending on what you're processing, storing, or transmitting, right? We talked about the self-assessment scoping. This is just a visual of what the assessment actually looks like on our site. We're gonna, if you're at level 1 from a scoping perspective, we're gonna look at those 6 family control families there, or family domains. The scoping for level 2, we're gonna look at the 14 families. So again, a lot more involved at level 2, right? Even from a self-assessment perspective, right? At level 2, you're able to produce, or rather you must produce, a system security plan and a plan of action and milestones if in fact needed. In either case, we have training courses that speak to those in no uncertain terms of what they comprise, what you should be thinking about in the sort of composition of those, and all factors appertaining. When we think about the self-assessment itself, again, the idea here being that it adheres to the FAR clause 52.204-21, and again, NIST 800-171 A. The assessment objectives are examined and tested. There's documentation created and updated for evidence. And again, to be compliant at level 1, for example, the contractor needs all findings to result in a met or non-applicable status, right? Now, most people say, well, what about an external service provider, Kareem? What about an MSSP or an MSP? Well, you can inherit practice objectives from an external service provider. However, right, and this is very, very key here, so I hope you're listening. If you do that, if you inherit practice objectives from an external service provider, you can do that, but you have to have what's called a shared responsibility matrix, which shows anyone who's looking at your environment, okay, here are the things that I am responsible for as the owner of the company, and here are these things that I've now placed under the purview of an MSSP or an external service provider, as it's more appropriately called. And again, do they have the credentialing to make sure, right, that in fact they're able to handle that for you? Again, these are all things that you'll want to make sure that you're absolutely aware of. But the idea is that the self-assessment provides companies with an overall process, how to document compliance, criteria, methodology, and practice findings. We talked about the performance of the gap analysis. Again, this is just a visual of it, right? So you'd see kind of what your assessment is, what the results yielded were. And then again, you're able to identify control gaps, right? Looking at those areas that report a not met or no status, right? So that you can then tailor your remediation efforts accordingly, right? Again, all designed to really speak in as close to layman's terms as possible for the small businesses as, you know what, just give it to me straight. Tell me what I've got to do. Tell me what I've got to know, right? Give me that findings report that I can produce right from Project Spectrum that you're looking at. And then I can go right from there and figure out exactly what I've got to do, many of which can happen right on projectspectrum.io, right? This is without even engaging a cyber advisor right away if you have a question. We talked about the development of remediation plan, just to give you a visual of what that would look like. For example, identifying and prioritizing gaps. It's going to outline specific actions, resources, timelines, and steps necessary to really close those gaps and enhance your security posture. We've got online courses, both long and in short form, right, to really help you. We've got a situation where you can set clear objectives and action items, right? Determine realistic timelines. How about testing and validation? How important would that be if you could determine continuous improvement initiatives while establishing realistic timelines throughout your cyber compliance journey, right? Implementation of security controls. Again, critical step towards remediating the gaps that were found after conducting the self-assessment process and the subsequent gap analysis. All right, so consider these following steps here. Everything from planning and preparation, the gap security controls, right? Being able to identify and collect evidence, updating documentation. Again, those 4 Ps again: plans, policies, procedures, and processes, right? Continuous monitoring on current posture, right? And then I talked about the preparation of documentation and evidence. So the cyber advisory services, being able to reach out to one of our cyber advisors at no cost for just if I just have a question, maybe it's about a training course, maybe it's something that I experienced on the site, or maybe it's something about my environment. I want to find out what is a network flow diagram. How do data configurations work in the context of me structuring my environment for CMMC compliance, right? Training materials, all these things are going to be invaluable to your journey, right? Everything from looking at, again, here, looking at your network topology, how are things set up here, right, in your environment? How is data moving? How is it protected at rest and in transit, right? Your system security plan, very, very critical, right? Probably the most critical. Again, it's going to lay out all of how things work in your environment. How's information moving? How are you processing? How are you storing? How are you transmitting? Where are things located in your environment, right? Incident response plan. This becomes absolutely critical. If anyone's been following the CERSIA, right, which is CISA's kind of introduction there, the act that they issued back in 2022, again, having to do with incident response plans. It's all lending towards this idea of, do I have a documentation set that speaks to how it is that I'm responding to a cybersecurity incident, right? Absolutely critical. Cannot overstate the importance of that enough. These are all things that Project Spectrum is well positioned to help you with. And so when you think about the conducting of assessments, this is just a visual. We think about the supply performance risk system, which is located within the procurement integrated enterprise environment. Again, that repository within the DOW. It's where the SPURS application access is going to be required. The score obtained from the Project Spectrum self-assessment tool is going to be used to upload to SPURS. And then again, contracting officers and their representatives will verify a company's assessment score in the supply performance risk system. So don't think that it's just this repository where things sit and they're not being reviewed. Nothing could be further from the truth. And then we'll talk a little bit about some of the resources, right? So what are some of the resources that Project Spectrum has? Well, again, I talked about the system security plan template from an artifacts assessment and advisory services perspective. I mean, the plan of action and milestones, the one-on-one cyber questions you can access Cyber Advisor. That's through our virtual help desk. If you were paying attention, there's a yellow icon. You see that yellow icon in the lower right of that picture at the bottom here, right? That's a recurring theme. You see it here as well in this screenshot on the self-assessment itself. That's where you're going to be able to access our virtual help desk, which is going to ultimately get you to one of our cyber advisors for questions that you may invariably have, right? So that virtual help desk is there, and you can drop your question in there. It'll bring up a web form. You pop your email in, ask your question or questions, and then it'll be triaged and routed to a professional to respond with you in short order. And again, that comes to you at absolutely no cost, right? That is the level and the extent of the department's commitment to say, hey, we hear you. We know that you need assistance with your cyber compliance journey in the context of being eligible for Department of War contracting, right? Consistent with, I think, the theme of what Kirsten Davies, the Department of War CIO, mentioned in that memo, right? This idea of, we're really here to help you all as small businesses and lessen the burden, right, of creating yet another barrier to entry to be able to do business with the Department of War, right? Much of that is built into what Project Spectrum's very existence speaks to, right? The fact that we want to deliver tools, templates, training, small businesses need to understand, assess, and advance their cyber compliance journey as it relates to CMMC and beyond, right? So whether that's training and education, whether that's through cybersecurity blogs that we're posting all the time, whether that's through informative videos, news items, right? Project Spectrum briefings. One of the things we did at just to give you an example, one of the things we did when this July 13th memo came out from the Department of War CIO is we not only posted a very, very targeted blog, we also posted obviously on our Project Spectrum social media account on LinkedIn, but we also created a live webinar. Right? We did a live webinar and we had over 500 some folks register. I think about 450 or so actually participated, and it was very, very well received. Again, timely, right? We took adequate time to digest what the memo actually said versus what, some of the misperceptions of it might have been, right? And we did that due diligence because that's what we do at Project Spectrum and Eccalon, right? We want to make sure that we understand what's transpiring, that we understand the guidance, and that we can see how that guidance marries up with actual policy, and then ultimately marries up with the resource provisioning that is Project Spectrum, right? So again, those are some of the resources. How can you connect with us? Well, projectspectrum.io is, again, the main portal that you're going to register so that you have access to all of these resources, which, by the way, are going to be invaluable regardless of what this 60-day pause materializes, right? We know that level 1 and 2 self-assessments are moving forward. That alone is enough information to say, if I'm a small business in the defense industrial base, I cannot afford to not progress in my cyber compliance journey, right? Support at projectspectrum.io. That's our main email address that you can reach out to us through. One of the things that Project Spectrum does, I talked about the training webinars for CMMC and some of the cyber circuit events. But one of the things that Project Spectrum actually also provisions is cyber advisory compliance packages. Now, we do that at cost. So everything that you'll see on projectspectrum.io, right, the self-assessments that you'll be able to take on there, the gap analysis you'll be able to do right on the website, the online training courses, all of that you'll be able to take advantage of at no cost to you, right? But if you're a company and says, I need a little bit more granular handholding, I need a cyber advisory compliance package that's going to really get into the particulars, really get into the depth, right? Looking at my specific company, my specific types of procurements that I'm going to be pursuing, my specific infrastructure, right? At a very, very deep level of granularity, we have cyber advisory compliance packages that speak to that we've created outside of what the Department of War has subsidized via Project Spectrum's online presence, right? So if that's something that you're interested in, and you say, you know what, I need kind of the soup to nuts, walkthrough of Project Spectrum, what it can offer, reach out to us as well at support@projectspectrum.io, and we can have a conversation about that and give you some more information on that. But again, those training webinars are absolutely there. Project Spectrum, again, I talked about our LinkedIn presence there at Project Spectrum, and then our YouTube presence as well. We post much of our webinar content out there, various interviews and things that we think are helpful that can help you understand cyber compliance and how your small business fits into that journey. Absolutely available to you on our YouTube channel. And then the virtual help desk, I talked about that. Please feel free to utilize that. Once you've registered, you have access to that. You can just pop in there, ask your question to a cyber advisor, and then they'll be able to get back to you again in short order there. But again, that question mark icon that's going to be in the lower right corner of most all of the web pages on the site, projectspectrum.io. And again, that's how you're going to be able to connect with our cyber advisement team. And with that, I thank you very, very much, and we can take a few questions.